All right. So let's go ahead and start. Actually, I forgot to pull up prayers. Let me do that real quickly. I think it's good for us to do a few prayers before we begin. I just have to find a folder that has the prayers in it. And then let me see on mm, where do I have those? Let's see, 2023 tour materials. We'll just pull this up. Great. Okay, let me pull those up from and share them on the screen. So again, we're going to begin with a praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. It says to recite this 3 times, but I think tonight or today we'll only do this 1 time, and then we'll do the additional prayers. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering, which again is a way of kind of creating some positive potential by making a vast, pure offering to receive these teachings, to engage in this workshop that we have here today. So you can visualize the entire phenomenal universe completely transformed into a beautiful Buddha paradise, however you want to do that. And we're offering that, this vast, pure offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And the final prayer we'll do before we begin is taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. We'll do this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi. Daki Chanyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam Ba Jang Chu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. All right, let's go ahead and do a real short meditation to get things started today. Beginning of the meditation, we're simply going to attend to the breath. And no doubt most of you have a meditation practice you do with the breath. But if you need a suggestion, just tune into the sensation at the tip of the nose. This is a nice point to work with where you feel the air coming in through the nostrils and then going back out. Just making that your focal point. Try to stay with that sensation as best as you can. And whenever the mind wanders away, then just simply guide it gently back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime here in the Gompa to start the meditation. And then I'll come in a few minutes after this silent meditation and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for being here today. So now let's set our motivation for our time together today. And we're all here because this topic of working with our anger is something we know we need in our lives, especially the world we live in today. Though obviously there's always been sources of anger, disappointment, resentment in our world. Right now, certainly there are many things going on in our world that can cause us to have that emotion arise. As we'll be discussing, I mean, some of the feelings we have might be justified and useful, but a lot of what we have that grows in our minds and in our hearts is dangerous, is something that causes us to be disturbed and moreover causes us to disturb the peace of others. So the initial motivation that we want to set for being here today is to really recognize the work that we can do for ourselves. We can cool the flames of anger in our own minds. We can find calm in the storm that is occurring around us and in our minds. Well, then we will experience greater peace. We will have greater well-being. Moreover, we'll be in a greater position, a better position, to be able to respond accordingly to what is going on in our world. So set that initial motivation as well as anything else that you feel brought you here today. Whatever other intentions, motivations that you might have. Initially for ourselves, we want to be here because we know we will benefit from working with this very volatile emotion. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we could also become a source of peace and patience in the minds and hearts of others? And we can generate that additional level of motivation to be here so that we can be of greater benefit, more skillful, more capable in helping others to overcome their patterns of anger. We may not be able to do that at this moment. We may find that our own anger is plenty to deal with. But nonetheless, wouldn't it be wonderful if the work we do on ourselves would eventually make us extremely capable, be able to cool the flames of anger in others? Let's try to hold that level of motivation as well. You're here not just for yourself, but for the welfare of others with whom you interact, come into contact with, and even for all beings, the beings of this world in particular, that we can benefit through having our own expertise in overcoming this mind of anger. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. Okay, again, welcome everyone online as well as here in the Gompa. Um, Just might do a little preface to this. I've been invited to do these 2 Saturdays because this is the first Saturday of this workshop. This was actually a course that I did many years ago, I think when Rachel Ryer was the SPC and we were over on 2nd Street. And we decided to try a little weekday workshop. This was a lunch hour on a Tuesday, we did for like 6 Tuesdays. And I've elaborated on this course over time. And I felt like it was time to resurrect it. And Nina and Venerable Dundrup were very happy to create the space in the calendar here for me to do these 2 Saturdays. I will be doing another workshop next month that's on forgiveness, which I may talk about a little bit in this course, because obviously that's once we've cooled our own anger towards others who've offended us and what have you, forgiveness might be the next step. And so that'll be just a one-day workshop in March, I think on the 23rd, something like that. But so let me introduce this topic by a quote that I actually found on Facebook just within the last week or two. One of my Facebook friends posted this from Pema Chodron. Many of us are familiar with Pema Chodron's work. And she has a little book of sayings, it's her little quotes called Comfortable with Uncertainty. And this little article is called Not Causing Harm. Learning not to cause harm to ourselves or others is a basic Buddhist teaching. Non-aggression has the power to heal. Not harming ourselves or others is the basis of enlightened society. This is how there could be a sane world. It starts with sane citizens, and that is us. I like this beginning part of the quote because essentially she's pointing out that there's two levels of harm. And initially we are kind of, as I said in the motivation, trying to eliminate the harm to ourselves, but also, of course, the harm that happens to others due to our not having tamed our own minds. The most fundamental aggression to ourselves, the most fundamental harm we can do to ourselves is to remain ignorant by not having the courage and the respect to look at ourselves honestly and gently. This is, again, what I want to introduce to sort of set the stage for today and next Saturday, is to be honest and gentle with ourselves. I mean, I'm not going to be asking you during this workshop, because it is meant to be a bit of a workshop. We're going to work with some practices, and I'll lead you in working with those and so on. But to be somewhat gentle, but to be honest. Every one of us has some moments of anger, no matter how patient you might think you are. No doubt you've had some things that have triggered you. We have to not kind of remain ignorant to those things. We have to actually be able to look at those and look at them with some gentleness, as well as, of course, the honesty that's required. The ground of not causing harm is mindfulness, a sense of clear seeing with respect and compassion for what it is we see. This is what basic practice shows us. But mindfulness doesn't stop with formal meditation. It helps us relate with all the details of our lives. I'll come back to the quote in a minute, but this is a concept we're going to talk about a bit today, of course, mindfulness. And most of you know this from your Buddhist practice or have heard of it even in the secular world, because mindfulness is getting to be kind of a buzzword in so many parts of our culture, even in the military. It's kind of strange. But nonetheless, mindfulness is not something we just practice when we're sitting and attending to the breath and trying to cultivate those sorts of that skillful awareness of what's going on. We want to take that off the cushion, obviously. That's the whole point of this workshop, is not so that you can just say, oh yeah, I had a lot of peace and calm while I sat with Don for these hours on a Saturday, but then I got totally crazed when I got back on the road here and whatever. I had two aggressive drivers behind me today. It was kind of fun. Oh, they're coming out just to test my patience, So, this is something we want to apply. We want to actually be able to kind of put it into action. And that's the whole goal of this. And that's why I've kind of written up some things for you and what have you that you can work with on the basis of the work that we do together on these 2 days. It helps us see, and this is mindfulness again, it helps us see and hear and smell without closing our eyes or our ears or our noses. It's a lifetime's journey to relate honestly to the immediacy of our experience and to respect ourselves enough not to judge it. And that's not what this course is about, is judging yourself on the basis of, oh God, I've got way more anger than everybody in the room or something. You know, you're a being like everyone else. We're all a combination of stuff going on in our minds. Just be honest with ourselves and compassionate towards ourselves. No judging necessary. And certainly it's not helpful. So as we become more wholehearted in this journey of gentle honesty, it comes as a shock to realize how much we've blinded ourselves to some of the ways in which we cause harm. Part of this I'm going to talk about a bit today too is some work I've been doing around nonviolence that's kind of opening my eyes a little bit to the way in which we are complicit with some things in our world that I think are worth sharing with all of you. But we do need to open our eyes to see the ways in which perhaps we are contributing to harm to others in this world, but certainly again to ourselves. Then she says, it's painful to face how we harm others, and it takes a while. It's a journey that happens because of our commitment to gentleness and honesty, our commitment to staying awake, to being mindful. And again, this is kind of the theme that I want to run through all of this, although we're going to be talking about patience and trying to identify anger more skillfully. It's gentleness and honesty. It's just really being able to be with ourselves. And you don't have to share any of what goes on in this workshop with anyone else. You don't have to share it with me or any of the other students who are here. this is the work that you do. And so there's never really a need to reveal that. We're going to have opportunities for people to share. And if you'd like to share, you have that invitation. But nonetheless, this is what the workshop's going to be. It's just that combination of gentleness and honesty with ourselves. I might point out that again at Venerable Dundrup has kindly made these available. They're on the TNL's, the Buddha Center, Dr. Norberling, the website there under this course. There's a little tab for course materials. Let me introduce you to those because I'm going to be working with those throughout this weekend. Very first one is a course outline. And I haven't divided it up to the 2 days because I don't know how far I'll get today, nor what I might need to cover in the next one, next Saturday. But I've divided it into kind of different categories. First, into two main topics. We're going to start today by investigating anger and patience, really understand the nature of these as they are presented in Buddhism. Talk a little bit about the mind in Buddhism, though again, I would guess that most of you have a good awareness of the centrality of mind. And of course, patience and anger are qualities of the mind. And then start to look at some of the factors that cause anger to arise. And we'll do kind of two levels of that, two different ways that we're going to investigate that. The rest of the outline, and what I really, again, want to be primarily focused on throughout this time together, is techniques to practice patience. There's a wonderful book by Venerable Thupten Chodron called Working with Anger that I've drawn a lot of the practices from, but also incorporated a few other things that are not necessarily from that book. It's a wonderful sort of companion book for this, but you don't need to read it by any means to get the principles of how to practice these various techniques. And what I did is I divided them into different levels of practice. I say first level, second level, third, fourth, fifth. And again, I'm basing that simply on what I would assess as the kind of difficulty of the particular topics that we might be introducing to use as an antidote to anger. What I'm going to be encouraging you to do throughout this weekend, though, I will be leading some of these as an investigation that we can do together, is to simply try them on and see what works for you. I mean, this is the wonderful thing about the Buddha's teachings, right? The Buddha never said, okay, I'm going to give you one meditation to work with overcoming your hatred. I'm going to give you one meditation to overcome your out of control desire. There's always like many, many antidotes, many approaches. I would say with anger, we probably have a wider array of things that we can work with compared to maybe some of the other afflictions, delusions. Now, in the end, there is a final antidote to all of our delusions, as we'll discuss towards the end of this, the wisdom that cuts through all of the ignorance that's guiding all of this. But nonetheless, there's many different tools that we can use. We often call these sort of temporal antidotes, or antidotes we can apply in the moment that are rooted in a more sound, a more sane understanding of what's going on. Okay. So we'll be looking at those, and I want you to simply try them on. And you'll have them all listed. You'll have some source materials that you can work with to review them. And those that you feel are really working for you, that are giving you something that you can investigate, and maybe that won't even be evident in the little bit of time that we have together these 2 Saturdays, but you can investigate them outside of the class and you can begin to look at them and see, well, are these really working for me? You don't have to try you don't have to do all of them. Certainly it's useful to kind of work with them initially to see their effectiveness for you. But we're all very different. Every one of us has certain dispositions and certain things that we resonate with. No doubt all of you who've been doing Buddhist study for many, many years know the things that you go to when you're having difficulties or problems that are useful for you. That's the wonder and the uh, amazing quality of the Buddha's teachings, giving us so many things to work with. All right, let's go to the next little file that is out there for you that Venerable Dundrup's put out there on the drive for you. This is a combination of practices, and I've sort of put these into separate pages so that you've got practice number 1. And those, by the way, were referenced on the outline. You'll notice that there's practices that have been inserted there in parentheses. I added that since the last time I taught this because I thought it would kind of be nice to line those up. I will be going through every one of these practices as we go through the weekend. So I don't need to go through them individually right now, obviously, but this is, again, hopefully something you can print out later or put on a tablet or phone, whatever, and refer to later. Then I've got some readings, and the readings I also will try to go through together with all of you as we go through the various topics. These are things that I primarily extracted from working with anger, as well as a book by His Holiness called Healing Anger, and then a number of other sources, different books on this topic. So again, there's quite a few pages of this, and I'm going to go through that, so I don't need to necessarily talk about it so much. All right. Any questions before we begin on those materials or anything? Okay. By the way, this is the book. I don't know if you can see it so much with the camera there, but it's called Working with Anger. And again, I remember reading this many years ago. I might speak a little bit about my own experience of approaching this. You might think, oh, Don gets angry. Don gets angry. Trust me. Talk to my partner. But when I first encountered Buddhism in the 90s in San Francisco, of course, I was driving and around in San Francisco, going to various places, what have you. And the traffic in San Francisco in the 1990s was nothing like it is today. I mean, my gosh, I drove back there even in the 2007 or something, over 10 years since I'd left there, and it was already horrendous. But you realize when you're driving in particular, if you start paying attention, how frequently we get angry and upset at things. It's a wonderful place to test stuff. But again, keep in mind that driving is also a very dangerous thing with what's going on in our world. But I was starting to see what was happening. That's always the first step, right? We have to see what this emotion is that's arising and not just follow it with a kind of reacting way, just immediately go to that place of anger. So what I was finding as I started working with these teachings when I was driving is that I would sometimes only catch it after I'd already flipped somebody off or something, right? After they already came zooming by me and I honked on my horn and was angry and upset. Oops. Whoops. Oh, there we go. Okay. Can you hear me now? Is it better? Still coming in? Okay, good. So I would catch it after the fact, right? I'd be sitting there and driving and I go, oh, wow, I just went to the place I don't want to go to anymore. you know, I just did it again. I stepped in it again. That's always kind of the initial recognition, right? Where you start seeing, oh God, I did it, but I can do something different. I can choose to do something different. This is how I want to kind of introduce this concept of working with anger, is to begin to see that it's a choice, that we don't have to follow that mindset. And throughout the weekend, I'm going to, or the 2 Saturdays, I'm going to distinguish between these two things of reacting versus responding. And I know this isn't quite a technical thing if you look up these in a dictionary or what have you. But we have reactions, which is kind of interesting. The word reaction, it's an action we are repeating, reacting, reacting, reacting. Anger is a reaction. It is something we continually go back to. It's our default mode. Responding means I'm going to actually be responsible. I'm going to take the responsibility to do something from my side that is different, that is not my reaction, that is not strengthening that pattern in my mind. I sometimes talk about the mind as if it's like somewhere where we've got like this deep groove, like if you're walking and then you see this huge chasm. Well, might have a tendency to fall in it. Why? Because it's so large. We've made it so very deep. Well, that's what a reaction is. It's something we have ingrained in our mind through the force of repeated behavior that is going to be in our default mode, something that we go to. That will fill up over time as we generate a kind of more wholesome, a more kind of healthier way of responding to things. We have to make that conscious choice. One of the things I also want to mention before we do get into more details on anger, and that is we're going to talk about anger as an emotion that comes through our mind. I'm going to try to avoid as best as I can using the words when you are angry. Why? Because I think it's really important from the beginning we make a distinction between these mental states, these things that are passing through, versus who we are. There's no such thing really as an angry person. There's a person who has anger in their minds. It's kind of based on the teachings in Buddhism that we see a kind of fundamental purity and clarity that's at the core of our minds. And we see these as simply clouds that are passing through that we can choose to identify with, but our identification with them is really kind of faulty. We'd be much healthier to identify with the vast spaciousness, the blue sky mind, as we often refer to, rather than the clouds that are passing through. This identification of ourselves as being angry, is that kind of label, I'm an angry person, it can solidify over time. And I have known people that I've talked to, and they say, well, I'm just an angry person. That's just who I am. Well, that's a strong identification with that delusion, right? That afflicted state of mind. You've concretized it to where that's your identity, and it becomes much harder to change it when that's the view that you have. And it's still changeable. I'm not saying it can't change, but when we are so strongly fixated on that is who we are. And some of you may say, well, maybe I've even said that to people. I'm just an angry person. You have to forgive me. I'll get upset at anything. Well, it's not true. You aren't an angry person. You're a person who has anger, and that anger arises from various causes and conditions. It can be changed. We all can change. Let's talk a little bit then about what we mean by anger and patience. And this is just so that we get quite clear on this. Even in my meditation I led, I was introducing the concept that we do have some forms of what we call anger in our world that are actually a useful tool, actually something useful for us to work with. So I'm going to go to the readings and we'll just start there. Again, I hope this doesn't become too difficult of sharing these readings on the page. I had some slides prepared, but I think it gets a little crazy because I'd rather that you, if you do have the readings in front of you, you can just follow along. You don't necessarily need to follow on the screen. Some passages regarding the nature of anger. A Venerable Chodron says, in Buddhism, anger is a mental factor. What do we mean by a mental factor? Right from the beginning, we're getting some Buddhist terminology. A mental factor is kind of something in our mind that has a particular function, a role that it plays. We talk about main minds being kind of the bucket of mind or consciousness in which everything is happening. But a mental factor gives some sort of definition or shape, some flavor to our minds. So it is a mental factor. In fact, it's one of what we call the non-virtuous, or I'm sorry, the afflicted mental factors. We don't identify them as non-virtuous in those categories. We have the virtuous mental factors and then what we call the afflicted mental factors. It's one of the root afflictions, in fact. So anger is a mental factor that, being unable to bear a person, an object, a situation, or idea, harbors ill will towards it or wishes to harm it. Anger covers a range of emotions, and I like to emphasize this, including annoyance, irritation, frustration, spite, belligerence, resentment, hatred, and rage. I like how she gives a number of these to work with because it's interesting. I mentioned earlier, I've been doing these nonviolence workshops, and one of the men that I do the workshop with has, we just did one last Sunday at First Presbyterian here in Santa Fe. And he really emphasizes that we don't have a really large vocabulary to deal with our emotions, our feelings. And it is kind of true. And even in Buddhism, we tend to pigeonhole all of this range of stuff into what we mean by anger, this one word. But anger, again, has many different layers to it. One that even wasn't mentioned in that reading is just this subtle sense of aversion, kind of the hairs going up on your neck, or just something like, ooh, that is the kind of the initial start of a movement of what can very easily become full-fledged anger. It's this reaction, again, to something that we don't want, that we don't like. It can be an object, it can be a person, it can be a political figure, it can be, what's going on in our world. Whatever ideas or stimuli come into our sphere of experience, some of them cause us to start going down that pathway. And for some things, it only is that kind of minor irritation or annoyance or aversion. And for other things, it starts to become deeper and deeper and deeper and can become, again, rage. And rage is outrageous. If we've ever been in that state where we've been kind of inflamed by anger, we know that that's obviously something we want to avoid. But we want to avoid this whole range of things. Again, if you were to go to a Western psychologist and say, I want to get rid of all of my annoyance and anger and irritation and frustration and rage and da-da, they would probably look at you and go, well, that's not healthy. You need a little bit of anger. You need a little bit of these things. because this is kind of in Western psychology, the status quo. In Buddhism, it's actually held that we can eliminate all of this and that all of it has some unhealthy or unwholesome feature to it. Except again, where we might have individual situations where we are having a strong aversion towards something that is going on in our world that requires our attention or even in our lives. Let's talk about that. This is a little quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I might not have finished this entire one here. Let me finish the bit of that Venerable Chodron has. Although the English word anger may very occasionally be used in a positive sense, here, as one of the root disturbing emotions, it has only a negative meaning. And that's how we're going to be working with it this weekend primarily. But this idea of it having on occasion a positive sense is what His Holiness speaks to. This is from his book, Healing Anger, where he gives commentary on Shantideva's text, the chapter on patience. He says the Tibetan word for it, and he was talking about hatred just prior to this, is jedang, which can be translated as either anger or hatred in English. However, I feel that it should be translated as hatred because anger, as it is understood in English, can be positive in very special circumstances. These occur when anger is motivated by compassion or when it acts as an impetus or a catalyst for a positive action. In such rare circumstances, anger can be positive, whereas hatred can never be positive. It is totally negative. So I'm going to be using the word anger throughout these 2 Saturdays solely in the terms of it being a negative emotion. And when I do use it to refer to anything that is a response to some social injustice or something that is going on, I will qualify it. But really, we are going to be focusing on when anger is a troubling state of mind, when again, it is fueled by all the various factors we're going to talk about. When we have an ability to work with our anger personally, I think we're much more capable to work with those more positive situations. You know, going to various, marches or things where we can often see that anger rises up within a number of people coming together to protest, to try to voice their concerns about what's going on. Anger is never going to be really positive in that way when it is a diluted state of mind. When we have this ability to really try to rectify things in our world from a place of wisdom and compassion and knowledge, well, then we have a very different mindset. And then we won't be destroying buildings or, doing all sorts of things that can happen often when people are protesting things going on in our world. And I know that perhaps some of you come to this weekend with a desire to how to be with all those things, maybe to go to protests and to how to control your anger. And what we're going to work on will certainly help you to do that. I don't know that I have an ability to kind of give you everything you would need to use your mind skillfully in the midst of a very active protest or what have you to keep it completely calm. But the tools that we're introducing throughout these 2 Saturdays will give you some idea of how to do that part of it. Then how to be with those other people who are protesting, how to be with situations that could potentially erupt into violence is very different. And obviously, that's a much more challenging situation. But I think we have to be responsive to what's going on in our world. And if we're sort of sitting at home and only doing the work on ourselves, then I think we're missing a valuable role that we can play in trying to change what's going on in our world and society at large and what have you. The wars that continue to go on. I mean, read something that somebody posted on Facebook. They look forward to the day when their children can ask the question, "Mommy, what was war?" When we have that as something of the past, when humanity has abandoned those sorts of things. Obviously, we see that anger, resentment, all these various emotions, they culminate in all that that's going on in our world, all the ways that people are abused and treated poorly, and the social injustice that occurs. So we do need the skills of working with our own anger, and then we can more capably work with kind of form of anger in a situation where we actually can perhaps do something to change things. So we're going to go more into anger, obviously. I'm not leaving it there. I just wanted to make sure that what we're talking about, we're all clear, is the kind of afflicted form of that, where we are feeling there's some disturbance in our minds, something that is disturbing for ourselves and again, often for others that we're interacting with. Let's look at patience, because patience, we hear this from very young age. Patience is a virtue, right? Venerable Children says, patience is an alternative. And she was just talking about, before this quote, again, I didn't want to put in too much of all of her book, but she was just talking about expressing or suppressing anger. This is kind of the way Western psychology often deals with it, right? They say you need to express your anger, and then they might even give you um, something to bat on a phone book or a pillow or something. I've done this sort of work where you kind of try to express your anger, get it all out of you. It doesn't really work so well, but nonetheless, suppressing anger, of course, most Western psychologists would not say that's an alternative or something we should pursue, because that just simply stuffs it inside and causes it to fester and grow within our own hearts and minds. But patience is the alternative to either of those. It's the ability to remain internally calm and undisturbed in the face of harm or difficulties. It's that place of calm. And I labeled this course Finding Calm in the Storm. Patience is the ability for us to find that place of calm, to be undisturbed. And of course, our parents told us when we were quite young, oh, be patient, but they never told us how. So hopefully these 2 Saturdays you'll get some tools about how do I cultivate patience by, again, disarming my anger, not allowing that anger to perpetuate. The Sanskrit word shanti, and this is in Shanti Deva, the great Indian master, Buddhist master of the 8th century, who wrote that wonderful text, The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the 6th chapter of which is on patience, again, that His Holiness comments on in that text that I mentioned earlier. It has no suitable equivalent in English. Here we use patience, but shanti also includes tolerance, internal calm, and endurance. Kind of interesting, right? Got many more flavors to it than what we normally refer to as patience in our culture. Thus, patience, she says, as it is used here, also includes these qualities. Being able to be more tolerant of what goes on. And not that we completely become like a doormat. This is not what patience is either. And there was that idea of endurance, that we do need a lot of patience to address what's going on in the world around us, and even those that we are with, if we can help them in some way. Again, if we haven't done the work on ourselves, very hard to do the work on others, if not impossible. So let's carry on with a bit more about patience and again, all the qualities that are involved here. I've taken from a more traditional Tibetan Buddhist kind of stages of the path approach to this for this next little section. I think it's the only time where I actually quote anything from one of the more traditional sources around Lam Rim. Patience is the opponent to anger. It eliminates your anger and malicious thoughts and reduces the anger of those wishing to harm you. Now, again, that may be the case sometimes. I'm not saying that being patient will always eliminate the anger of the person who's around us. Sometimes it doesn't. We can be very patient, and that person might even get annoyed at our patience. That does happen. But nonetheless, it is something that generally diffuses situations. If we are patient, then there's no one there to tangle with, right? There's no one to fight with. Right? Patience is a virtuous mind that can remain indifferent to any form of harm inflicted by others, can voluntarily endure any form of suffering, and remain definitely thinking about the Dharma. These are the 3 types of patience that are normally talked about in the Tibetan Buddhist studies. I'm not going to go into all of them. The first 2 perhaps being the most important for what we're looking at in this workshop. How do we deal with suffering that occurs in our lives? We all are dealing with just the reality of this existence and living, but also when others harm us, when others do things that irritate us. These are the sorts of things that we're going to be primarily focused on. But we also need some patience in regard to our practice of changing our minds. And I will talk about that a little bit because our minds can be difficult to change. Patience guards your mind from being disturbed by any harm or difficulty. Again, this is the role of patience. We often talk about the armor of patience. It's like putting on armor so that we can't be pierced by what's going on and that we can have a safe place from which to act again and respond to what's going on. And both of these are within what we call mind. And I just want to spend a little time on mind because most of you are quite familiar with what we mean by mind in Buddhism, but it's good to reacquaint ourselves with that. The term mind, Venerable Chodron says, refers to the experiential, cognitive, intellectual, perceptual, and feeling part of us. It is non-material in nature, meaning it has no physical form, no color, no shape, nothing, while our body, made of atoms, is material. Within the broad category of mind, we find many types of mind. Among these are sense consciousnesses, which perceive external objects such as sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches, tangible objects, and our mental consciousness, which thinks, dreams, sleeps, and can experience spiritual realizations. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about this. The idea again that in Buddhism, mind encompasses the whole range of everything. So when we often talk about our heart or feelings or whatever, all those are encompassed in mind. Mind is central into everything that the Buddha taught because our mind has this non-material component to it. It is not physical. It's not our brains. It's not something produced by electrochemical charges, being uh, uh, kind of going into action in our minds, all the stimuli that are happening there. We do have ways that our brain influences what we think about and what we experience. And the physical body, even in terms of our sense consciousnesses, is involved in helping us to access various data that are outside of ourselves. But nonetheless, mind has a non material component. And of course, there are many ramifications of this. I'm not going to spend much time talking about those. But I want to delineate how those five sense consciousnesses are really, I don't like to put them down or anything. They're somewhat dumb consciousnesses. They don't have any intellect to them. They are simply ways in which we know various phenomena. Eye consciousness, knowing the sights that we see, again, color and shape. Our ear consciousness is knowing sounds, all the various types of sounds, what have you. These bring in data. And of course, they play a role, as we're going to talk about with regard to anger, because it's oftentimes that we have anger rising on the basis of things that we have brought in through the doorways of our senses, things we've heard through our ears, things we've seen through our eyes, reading the morning news and all the people that are, doing this and doing that. We bring that information in. It's primarily our mental consciousness that is the workshop, though. Because our mental consciousness contains our conceptual mind, our thinking mind, the mind that takes all that raw data and makes things out of it, creates ideas on the basis of it, right? And sometimes the ideas are formulated by others in terms of like what we read on the internet, in terms of the news or what have you, and it has a particular message. But then we often have our own way of working with it in our mental consciousness. It's really important that we understand the role that our minds play in regard to overcoming anger through practicing patience. It's the main practice. And we can use other things that are involved. But nonetheless, this is how we actually change our minds, is by being attentive to our thoughts. It's kind of interesting, and this is going to come up, I think, in one of the readings in a moment. Anger is actually a thought. And when I first came to Buddhism and I was learning this, I was like, no, anger is an emotion, right? We tend to put that label in Western psychology of it being an emotion. Well, in Buddhism, we even call it an afflictive emotion, but that doesn't kind of reduce it down to just this impulse or something that's happening in our bodies. It has a physical component because we all know what it feels like when we have anger arising in our minds. But it's actually a thought. It is actually a way of framing things through our mental consciousness so that we then have that reaction. And this is, again, really key to understanding the way that anger works. We'll get into that shortly in terms of the various readings that pertain to the processes by which we have this disturbing emotion. So, anger, she says, like all emotions, is a type of mind. It is a mental factor. Again, we've seen that term before, that accompanies our mental consciousness. Thus, it may be affected, either subdued or inflamed at the mental level. Patience, love, compassion, and joy are similarly mental factors. that accompany our mental consciousness, albeit not at the same time as anger. This is what's interesting, and this is this whole idea that His Holiness the Dalai Lama emphasizes constantly, is that the main technique of working with these deluded states of mind, these afflictions such as anger, is to work with those things that are counter to them. Why? Because the primary reason is because they cannot arise in the mind at the same time. It's kind of the law of opposites, right? If you have light on in a room, darkness cannot be there. If there's darkness there, then light is not there. These two preclude each other. Where there is darkness, there is no light. Where there is light, there is no darkness. Where there is anger, patience cannot be at that time. Where there is patience, anger cannot abide at that time. This is the whole principle that we're using in Buddhism, primarily when we're talking about these antidotes, the ways of overcoming our afflicted states of mind. And we have pairs for other afflictions, right? Instead of having jealousy, we have a mind that takes delight and rejoices in the good things that others have. Instead of having, hatred's very similar to anger, but instead of having hatred, we have love. These are diametrically opposed. And we're going to be looking at this, but His Holiness also emphasizes how those that are in the category of the delusions, the afflictions, such as anger, hatred, and so on, don't have solid ground. They are not valid thoughts. This is something we're going to get into shortly. Every one of those afflicted states of mind is not working with reality. You are not in touch with reality when those are in your mind, when you're reacting from that place. Love, compassion, patience, all these wonderful qualities that we, when we hear them, we even get little good feelings in our heart, right? They are grounded in validity. They do not have this root of not being correct. They might still be with some slight error at the very subtle level, but when they're looking at what's going on, they are actually assessing things pretty correctly. Let's just, I'm going to get into this next Saturday more around the idea of kind of working with others and trying to open our minds to the experience of others and so on. Let's just look at this idea of hatred and love being kind of diametrically opposed and also not grounded in reality. Hatred is looking at what we are experiencing on the basis of a person who is harming us or saying something to us that we don't like, and so on, all the various things that can happen. And we are labeling that person as entirely bad on the basis of that. We are covering them with that badness, totally oblivious to anything else that might be there. And this can even happen with people who we're quite close to. All of a sudden they turn into somebody that's like, who are you now? That's not who you are. And we will label them for that moment when hatred or anger is arising entirely in that way, as if that is the sum total of who they are. And moreover, we even tend to exaggerate it. We even make them worse than what they are. Well, is that grounded in reality? No, because that's not the sum total of that person. As I always point out when we start talking about these sorts of concepts, think about the time when somebody got angry at you because you were doing something really annoying, right? You were doing something that bothered somebody. Is that the sum total of who you are, that annoying, bothersome person, right? You're so much more than that, right? You're not. It would be unfair for someone to label you as entirely bad, evil, whatever, on the basis of that one moment in your experience. When, yeah, you lost it. And whatever was going on, other causes and conditions, you said something or did something that upset somebody. That's not the sum total of who you are. So this is why hatred, anger, all these afflictive emotions can be eliminated, is because they don't see things correctly. They are exaggerations, they are misperceptions. We're going to deal with this term shortly called they are inappropriate mental attention. They are you attending to something mentally in an inappropriate way, in a non-valid way. Nonetheless, we do it all the time, right? We have to learn to see the lack of validity there. Let's look on the other side at patience, love, compassion. We're going to look specifically at love. Love is if you take that person who is saying something bad to you and you're going to choose to look at them through the lens of love. We're not talking about romantic love. We're talking about love that is the sincere wish for someone's happiness. Sometimes we can do self-love where we're sincerely wishing for our own happiness and well-being. Here we're talking about that person. That person, we are wishing for them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. Sounds perfectly valid to me, right? And in fact, if they had happiness and the causes of happiness in that moment, they wouldn't be doing the things that they're doing to annoy us, probably, right? They would be much saner, much calmer, more in touch with things. It's a completely valid state of mind. As His Holiness often points out, when a valid state of mind meets a non-valid state of mind, which wins? The valid state of mind will win out in the end. But I'm not saying that just one moment of love is going to overcome all of your anger and hatred, right? That's not how easy, things go. We have to do the work. But in the end, those states of mind that are valid will win out in our own hearts and hopefully in our world as well. We do all have that potential to replace all those afflictive emotions that are not grounded in reality with those that are. And we'd be much happier as human beings ourselves, and everyone around us would be much calmer, and we could hopefully help them on their path as well. But this is the logic for the work that we're doing these 2 Saturdays, is to really get down to picking this apart. And I'm going to use this word reframing. Reframing is used in Western psychology in a similar way, though not identical. By reframing, I mean that we are going to choose to look at things differently. Just like these 2 examples of, rather than framing it in terms of hatred, this person is awful, I hate them, why are they doing this to me, blah, 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 and labeling that way and generating that state of mind towards them, I'm going to choose to reframe it, to see them as a suffering sentient being, a being who wants to be happy, who doesn't want to be in that afflicted state themselves. And I'm going to see them through the lens of love. Right there, that's already one technique, very basic technique that is a bit hard to practice sometimes with certain individuals. I'm not saying that we can always pull out this tool of love and it works perfectly, but we can train ourselves. That's the whole thing that we're working on in Buddhism constantly is training, mind training. We use that term in a very specific way, and we'll touch on some of the techniques taught in what we call traditionally mind training or lojong. But all of Buddhism is mind training. Training our minds, changing our minds, developing the more positive qualities, reducing the negative tendencies. This is our job. We have no other job, right? So, all right, let's just do a little bit more. And then with these 2 hours, I'd like to take just a very short stretch break because I know it's a lot for people sitting online as well as here in the Gompa. So it says here, okay, I stopped there, not at the same time as anger, kind of towards the middle of that paragraph there, little bit towards the end. They too, patience, love, compassion, and so on, can be enhanced or diminished at the mental level. For this reason, the Buddha emphasized that our mind is the source of our suffering and happiness. Yes, people outside of ourselves do contribute to our suffering or happiness. I'm not denying that they play a role, but your mind is the chief creator of your source of your suffering and happiness. So we have to understand that these states of mind can be adopted and we can cultivate those that are more positive and regardless of what's going on around us, be happy and not suffer. So let's just go through this section here and then we'll take a little break. The word mind may also be translated as heart. I mentioned this earlier, that kind of these all get lumped together, as in that person has a kind heart. Here we see that Buddhism does not make the distinction between thinking and feeling that we make in the West, where we believe that thought is conceptual and emotions are not. Indeed, Sanskrit, Pali, and Tibetan, all languages in which Buddhist texts are written, have no word which is a direct translation of emotion. Kind of interesting, we take some of our English words, they don't have a direct equivalence in these other languages, but some of the terms they have there are much richer than what we have in our English language. It kind of goes both ways. From a Buddhist perspective, many emotions, such as anger, have a feeling component, but are conceptual. This is what I mentioned earlier. They are actually thoughts, for they know their objects by means of a mental image. This is what defines what we mean by a conceptual mind. For example, we can be angry when the person at whom we are mad isn't even in the room, right? At that time, we're not perceiving the person with our eyes, but we are thinking about them, and that a mental image of them appears in our mind. This is, again, I don't want to go too far into what's called Buddhist epistemology, but they essentially say that whenever we are having a conceptual mind present, we're only working with this mental image, an idea of that object. And even when they're present, we're often still working with a mental image that we start layering stuff on top of. Like I was saying, when you have that mind of hatred towards that person, first you have the concept of that's the sum total of that person. They are a horrible, awful, evil person. And then we exaggerate that even more. All of that's happening in the conceptual mind. It is not involved in any of the other consciousnesses. The mental consciousness is the one that actually takes these ideas, this image, and runs with it. And it can do, the opposite. Again, it can overlay positive qualities and what have you. It can have all sorts of uh, beautiful, wonderful things that occur. But the workshop, again, is the conceptual mind. But the conceptual mind is always working with just an idea of what things are. It's not working with the actual object. This is something, again, that creates some level of error, but nonetheless, we can still work with things that are ideas of something because those are good enough to work with. They do still, cause us some movement of our minds. But when the mind of anger or these destructive minds are present, we don't usually realize that that's what we're doing. We're only thinking about an idea of that person. We're no longer caught up in reality. So again, we're not completely wanting to throw conceptual mind out with the the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. The conceptual mind has some value because this is how we actually create the more positive thoughts that counter the negative ones. But we have to see that conceptual mind does have some level of error, some mistaken quality to it. It's not actually working with the real object, it's working with an idea of things. I mean, look at, I would guess that most of us have had at least some time in our life where, talking about anger, where we've had some resentment that we've carried with us for some period of time. Somebody did something to you. And then we know that it can happen in very horrible ways, horrific ways, where someone is abused, sexually, physically, what have you, when they're quite young, and they carry that with them constantly. But what happens when we carry an idea of something is that we're no longer working with the reality of whatever that person or experience was. We are working with our idea of that. Becomes much, much bigger, much, much greater, and gets influenced by a lot of other stuff that may have nothing to do with what actually occurred. I'm not denying there was suffering that occurred. Don't get me wrong. There's a suffering experience. What I'm pointing to is the fact that we do tend to, through rumination and various things, we work with this image that gets enhanced and gets changed and gets filtered through all kinds of other stuff that is no longer really in touch with what exactly happened with the person who was involved, for example. So again, just be aware of that. This is what happens through our thoughts, and this is why anger can become so destructive in our lives, is because you can hold on to things as long as you wish, right? You can keep recycling it and generating even greater energy around it. This is what goes on in our world. I mean, my gosh, Palestine and Israel and so many parts of the world where there's conflict and what have you, and people like butting heads for centuries, just continuing to perpetuate ideas of who the other side is that are not grounded in reality. Again, we even know those experiences happen, right? When people have the opportunity to sit down, Israelis and Palestinians, and look at each other and talk to each other, they come to see the humanity of each other. They come to see something very different. Our conceptual mind creates mental images and ideas of who people are that may have nothing to do with who they really are, right? So already we're getting a feeling for kind of why we're in the situation we are of having anger arise. The primary thing is this distortion that happens with our conceptual mind, that we need to introduce healthier concepts, more wholesome concepts. All right, let's take a little break. It just turned 5 after the hour. So take 5 minutes and take a break, and we'll come right back. All right, let's go ahead and get started again. Before I go into the next section, and we'll see if there's some questions in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about what Buddhism says in terms of the arisal of anger, or any afflictive emotion for that matter. Oftentimes they talk about 6 factors being involved, but I'm only going to focus on 3 main things. We're going to go through what Venerable Chodron says in a moment, where she talks more extensively about this. But the very first thing that causes anger to arise is an object. I mean, there has to be some object, something that begins the process to some extent. It's something that we generally find unfavorable. It can be a thought, a memory. As I was saying, if you have a memory of somebody who offended you sometime in the past, you're bringing that to mind, and that idea of that memory of what occurred is the object. It can be something that is happening in the moment, in the present. It can be something that someone says, or again, something we read online. Maybe we have that temptation to go down to the little comments part of the news where we see what people are saying about the news, and we read something that just really gets our goat, right? We're like, oh my gosh, this idiot, what is he saying? She's saying, whatever. Anything that is kind of, again, coming in that is registering generally with an unpleasant feeling. What the Buddha says is we have 3 different types of feelings that can occur at any moment in time. One of them is pleasant, one of them is unpleasant, and the other one is neutral. The neutral feelings aren't really that horribly interesting, right? They're just kind of a flat line. We're not really doing anything with those. But where we get into trouble is, of course, with the 2 poles of something that is pleasant, something that is unpleasant. Anger is the response, or that whole pattern, that range of emotions, is what happens when something unpleasant comes into our field of experience. Again, to the untrained mind, to the mind that is simply reacting from a place of anger. The other side of it, I do want to mention, because we can frame anger in terms of this other experience. When we have pleasant things coming into our lives, generally Buddhism is labeling the emotion that arises on the basis of that as attachment, desire. What it does is it kind of takes that pleasantness and it exaggerates that in the object. Just like anger exaggerates the unpleasantness, as I was alluding to earlier, it exaggerates the pleasantness. And it moreover wants to continue to have that object in our lives. So we all know our own objects of attachment, right? You know, the foods that we like, the various things that we go to, even people that we enjoy, whatever, that we get quite attached to. We really want them around us. We want them to stay in our lives. We get upset when they're not there. And that's how we can frame anger often, is that sometimes the object for us is simply not getting what we want. You know, going to our favorite restaurant and seeing that the dish we were planning to get that's always so delicious, they aren't offering that night. You know, we're like, what happened? Oh, you know, well, we didn't get the food that we needed to prepare it, so we can't prepare it tonight. And you're just like so disappointed because what you were expecting, what the mind of attachment was working with, was your projection of that pleasant experience that you no longer can have, right? Because they're not going to serve your favorite dish. So this is one way to frame what's going on with anger often too, is it's not just necessarily an object that's coming in and upsetting our minds. It can be even the absence of something that we desire. And when we don't get what we desire, then anger is often the response or the reaction. All right, so the very first of these 3 factors is an object, is something that stimulates you in an unpleasant way that then becomes the basis. Now we in the West, we put everything on the object, right? Or we sometimes in Western psychology, they call this the trigger, right? You know, it's a trigger for you. Well, the trigger is the problem. And I would say, again, our first line of defense, we're not going to go into this in terms of one of the practices necessarily, but your first line of defense in dealing with anger is to not be in touch with the object. You know, for most of us, we need some distance between ourselves and the object because the object is too strong for us to deal with in the moment. We know what our reaction is going to be because that object is one that we're habituated to having that anger arise in regard to that experience. So it does make some sense to put some onus on the object. But in the West, we put 100% on the object. I think it has nothing to do with my mind. It has everything to do with the annoying thing that this person is doing or whatever. And if they just stopped doing all this, I'd be fine, right? Have we ever said that to ourselves? If everyone else wasn't so darn annoying, well then, you know, I'd be happy. I'd be peaceful. Well, if you want to try to find a place where you can be totally isolated from anything that's going to annoy you, well, good luck. I mean, even these folks who find an idyllic way of living and being, and they've got so much money that they can just surround themselves with comfort and luxury and what have you, they're still going to have things that trigger their their mind with some sort of unpleasant sensation or feeling or thought or whatever. You can never isolate yourself completely from the objects. Nonetheless, it is not a bad thing to, separate yourself somewhat from the object, at least temporarily, until you have the strength of mind to deal with the object more constructively. The second factor that plays a role in terms of the object, the anger arising, for example, is what we call the seed of that emotion. Now, again, in Buddhism, we use that term of like a seed or a propensity. But I would say in Western psychology, they would just say, you have that habit, that pattern that is already there. In Buddhism, we say that every time that we have a mind of anger, we plant a seed for a future mind of anger. It's just a way that sort of energetically, we just keep anger cycling in our minds. As long as you have the propensity for anger to arise, well, then anger can arise. In Buddhism, of course, we say that there is a possibility, as I was alluding to earlier, where you can get rid of all the seeds of anger, all the seeds of all the delusions, to where you never have that propensity for them to arise again. You can be with whatever objects, and you're not going to have the potential for anger. We're not there yet. I'm not there yet. Maybe all of you are there, but I'm not there yet. So I need to be aware of something more than just the seed, because the seed is going to be there and cause it to arise. Am going to have that propensity. So let's look at the third factor. Again, I alluded to this earlier. It's got a fancy name to it. It's called inappropriate mental attention. Inappropriate mental attention means that that object appears and that you have the seed for anger. You are going to choose to look at it a particular way. Now, choose is a very kind of controversial word because for most of us, because it's a reaction, there's not much choice involved in terms of conscious choice. It's not like I go, oh, there's somebody, speeding behind me that's coming up behind me and is going to, be really annoying and honk on their horn as they try to pass me or whatever. I don't say, should I get angry or not? Well, maybe today I won't. That's not usually what happens. Most people just immediately fall into that groove, fall into the pattern of anger. So again, even though we call it a choice of, how you are going to frame and look at it, we have to learn how to do that. That's what we're doing in this workshop. Inappropriate mental attention means I'm going to choose to look at it in a way that is not in line with how it actually exists, not in line with what is the healthiest response to what's happening. Let's look at what Venerable Chodron says in regard to this, because I think it's really quite helpful. She goes into this inappropriate mental attention. The forerunner to anger is a mental factor called inappropriate attention that in this case exaggerates the negative qualities of a person, object, situation, or idea and projects onto it negative qualities that are not there, thus creating an incorrect story about it. For example, Dave walks into the office one morning and his colleague, who is preoccupied, doesn't greet him. He thinks, oh, this person is unfriendly and rude. And based on this inappropriate attention that projected meaning and motivation onto the other's action, he becomes irritated. His internal irritation leads to external action, and Dave makes a sarcastic remark, which hurts his colleague, and she in turn snaps back at him. We can easily see how one instant of inappropriate attention and anger can set off a chain reaction of events, causing ourselves and others misery. Again, this is one example, but we're doing a form of inappropriate mental attention almost from the get-go. When something unpleasant comes into our experience, we are, first of all, again, focusing on that negative quality. That's the main thing that we are seeing. We are blind at that moment to anything that is positive about that person or situation. We then think that that is, again, the total of that. We sort of coat the entire thing with that negativity and we exaggerate it. We bring it up to another level. And then these other thoughts may start coming in as well. Well, God, that person's really a jerk, you know. Or we might even go through some other thoughts of, well, I must have done something. Why are they being this mean to me or awful? We have a lot of different thoughts that can arise. With the mind of anger, it tends to be the thoughts that are pigeonholing them into that category of an evil, awful person and making them into an enemy. We use this term enemy, it's kind of a strong word. It's an undesirable person, someone who we don't want to be around, someone who is out to harm us. We have created that. Is that person really an enemy? Well, they might have actually been a very good friend that suddenly, you know, on that particular day, like was what happened with the situation that Venerable Children explained. Normally, they're quite friendly. They come into work, but that day, they're avoiding you. They're being weird. Well, what's going on? We like to think that that's a message that we need to then fill in the holes, and we've filled in the holes correctly, but we haven't. Do we really know what's going on with that person? Or have we really taken the time to communicate with that person and investigated what's going on so that we then can make an accurate assessment of what's happening? But we react this way all the time. You know, and for some of us, it becomes, again, a pattern that is very hard to break because we are filling in those gaps with our own thoughts, our own inappropriate attention. This is, again, one of the biggest factors in when we talk about, again, there are three other factors that play a role, but they're a little more peripheral. What we're talking about with these three is the exact pattern that generally occurs. An object comes into our field of experience that is unpleasant for us, person, words, whatever. We have the seed for anger to arise because we haven't gotten rid of it yet. We have that still there as a propensity. And we think about that situation or person incorrectly, where it feeds the flame of anger. Starts off, I mean, really, I'm going to get into this a little bit too. I keep talking about things that I'm going to get to today, hopefully. But it all starts out as an unpleasant sensation. What would it look like to stop it right there? Just go, oh, that's unpleasant, but I don't need to go anywhere further with the whole thing. Does it really matter? You know, just an unpleasant sensation to hear that person's voice, to see them, whatever, to have that particular, you know, experience. Go to the restaurant, they don't have your favorite dish. You go, oh, that's unpleasant, but you can let it go, right? You know, but we choose to invest so much in all the additional thoughts, right? We really get into all of that. We even talk to other people about it, right? You know, maybe Dave gets on the phone with a coworker. He says, "You won't believe what that woman did when she came in. You know, she looked at me and da da da, and makes up all this stuff." And then that woman goes, "Whoa!" Or the other person he's talking to says, "Oh yeah, I know her, and she did the same thing to me." And blah 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 blah. I mean, does it sound familiar? Right? We escalate. We keep these things going, and so much harm that we do to ourselves, but also to others through the force of these uh, inappropriate thoughts. And if we were to talk about uh, boiling those words, inappropriate mental attention, down to something in lay language, it just means you're thinking wrongly. You're thinking incorrectly. You're not really thinking soundly or in line with how things actually are. Let's go on to, I think she's got a little bit more on this, or no, this is where I want to introduce this concept that I found really, really helpful. We don't talk about this in Tibetan Buddhism so much. There's a wonderful Buddhist teacher, Larry Rosenberg, who wrote a book called Living in the Light of Death. And he talked about this concept. And I found a nice little passage on something called the American Buddhist website. I never even knew such a thing existed. This is what this concept is called, the two arrows. And it's a really useful way to frame our working with this idea of inappropriate mental attention. There's a classic Buddhist parable of the two arrows. It's actually from what's called the Salata Sutra. Salata means arrow. And that sutra is in the Pali Canon. In brief, the idea is that most people, when hurt, add to the hurt. If shot with an arrow, this is the example. I mean, it's not saying you're really physically shot with an arrow. If you're shot with an arrow, we spend a lot of effort focused on wondering why we got shot, how we didn't deserve that, how the person who shot the arrow is a jerk, what we are going to say when we get in front of him or her, and so on, right? It's like being struck by a second arrow. The first one is physical, and the second is mental. We could say the first one is often something we experience through our senses. It's the unpleasant sensation. we can even have it with thoughts, but it's the unpleasant feeling that we have at that time. Yes, that's the first arrow. What you do with that is entirely up to you. And most people create a second arrow, right? The second one is mental. It's totally in our minds, in our thought consciousness in particular, our conceptual mind. In contrast, it said, if we are able to maintain our mindfulness and not spin off into a story about our pain, we only get struck by one arrow. I might even go further than this. This author of this, there wasn't a name there, but whoever runs this American Buddhist website says, I might even go further than this. Once we start down the story road, we not only make ourselves feel worse, which is the second arrow, but then we are more likely to do something that makes the situation worse. And this is the third arrow. And we cause even further pain that's outside of perhaps even our own mental landscape, might even cause pain to that person who shot the first arrow. So again, say somebody does say something really painful that to hear, to you, that pain is the first arrow. How you frame it, how you look at it, how your mind works with it is the second arrow. And it's an arrow you're directing at yourself. You're causing your own pain by doing this. That other person is kind of doing whatever they're doing, right? They might go on and think, oh, and this little interaction with us, but they're not being hurt by that arrow. We're hurting ourselves with that arrow. We're causing our own agitation, our own rumination on that situation, what happened, going through those thoughts again, what a jerk that person was. They really deserve to have somebody, happen to them. They'll get their karma yet, whatever, all these phrases that we generate. That's torturing us. It's not torturing the other person at all. We're inflicting pain on ourselves. Then, as was alluded to, and I've never seen this other than in this website or a reference to a third arrow. A third arrow is where, again, we will potentially, if this gets strong enough, maybe do something to that person or to something else, and that inflicts greater harm on ourselves too. It's not to say that that's only an arrow directed outward. That's a third arrow that pierces our own sort of integrity and who we are by us resorting to actions that are driven by mistaken ideas, right? Like say, what was going on in that scenario that Venerable Children talked about, Dave, and this woman who is avoiding him and neglecting him or whatever. He starts having the inappropriate attention, which is the second arrow. The first arrow was simply having her walk by and not say hello or whatever. Then it said that he actually, makes a sarcastic remark. That's the third arrow, right? It's like, why debase yourself to that when you don't even know what's going on for that woman? Well, and maybe she just got really bad news about a loved one who's quite ill or something, and that she was not in the frame of mind of like, oh, hi, everybody, good to see you again. Instead, she's really quite solemn. You don't know that person's story. If you don't know that person's story, well, then don't make one up. It's not worth it. Just again, causing harm to ourselves by agitating ourselves, thinking this is our assumption about that person, and it's real. It's only an assumption. It's only a thought process. Okay? So this is actually the first practice. Let me actually put that on the screen. And I don't know if we'll have time to go through all of these practices together, but I really would encourage you to work with these as best as you can. The very first practice in becoming aware of the arising of anger goes through a set of questions that are pertaining to each of these arrows. And I put these together. I hope they're useful. If you feel that something in there, the wording doesn't work for you, or you need to add another thought that you came up with, add it in. I mean, this is very flexible. This isn't something that's, again, directly from a sutra or something of the Buddha. These are the questions that I would encourage you to ask if you have the opportunity to see what's going on. And usually it starts with smaller things, right? Smaller annoyances. You can perhaps pick up on what's going on. What is the object, person, situation that's triggering your anger? Is this something that you have encountered previously? What specifically is it about that object which makes it a trigger for you? This is what's kind of interesting is we don't all have the same triggers, right? You know, some things may really get our goat, but the other person they're fine with. Oh, I don't care. I mean, I'll get another dish. They don't have my favorite dish, not a big deal. Food's good here. I don't have to worry about getting my favorite dish. I'll come next time and get it or whatever. Number four, do you think it is also a trigger for everyone else? Again, kind of that thought. If you start to see that, no, this is your stuff, this is your reaction, which is all about your own expectations, your own desires, what have you. And number five, what would it look like for you to avoid the object? That is, as I said, the very first line of defense. And for some things, it is best that you do that, that you actually say, okay, I know that this particular person in my family, is not a very good person for me to be around because I don't have the strength of mind to be able to keep my thoughts in a proper place and to keep my mouth from spitting out all kinds of stuff. I'm not there yet. So it's best that I don't go to the family gathering if I know they're going to be there. All right. Nothing wrong with that. That shouldn't be your plan of action for the rest of eternity. Because again, it's not going to happen. Annoying things are going to come into your sphere of experience. Trust me. We all know this, right? You cannot keep yourself from having those. And even like there's that one story of like the monk that's up in the cave meditating, and caves are not exactly the exact ideal place to be, but nonetheless, you can be very happy, I suppose, shutting yourself from a lot of stuff. He's taking a little break and he's outside of his cave, and a wandering kind of lama comes by and says, "Oh, hi up there, what are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, I've been meditating on patience." He says, "Oh, that's good to hear. You mind if I come up for a while?" And the lama goes up there and starts fidgeting with all the stuff that the person has in their cave, their few little possessions, until suddenly the meditator who was in the cave practicing patience loses it, right? Well, because it takes actually the objects to help us to test this. The first arrows do have to happen for us to actually go, oh, wow, now I can be patient with that first arrow. You're never going to be at a shortage of first arrows. And that's where I would guess that even in that cave situation, there's something annoying that person before the monk or the lama shows up and kind of tests them. We need those things, though, to kind of show, well, are we doing better? When I go back on the road after practicing patience, am I much more patient with the drivers behind me that are like on my tail and wanting to go around me, or the people who cut me off or whatever? Am I able to just kind of not get upset? That may be the first step. Maybe I start wishing them well over time, but at least not get upset. At least not have that be like, oh, it ruined my day because of those horrible drivers on the road. First arrow stuff is important to pay attention to. What are your first arrows? What is it that really triggers things for you? And again, maybe consider giving some distance between you and that arrow for the time being. Second arrow, what are the thoughts that followed upon experiencing the trigger? Try to be somewhat mindful. Again, we haven't talked about mindfulness yet. It's a very important tool. You have to be able to kind of hone in to or tune in to kind of what's going on. What are the thoughts arising immediately after experiencing that? To what degree do I start framing it already in regard to this inappropriate attention, which again is what the second arrow is all about? Number two, if you have encountered this situation before, if this is a repeat trigger for you, repeat first arrow, are the thoughts you now have similar to what you had on other occasions? In other words, start to see the habit of it. Again, this is where I was talking about reactions, reacting out the same thing that you did before. If you can see that there's a pattern, that every time that I'm running into that negative stimulus, that suddenly I'm reacting in a very similar way, well, then we start getting real clear about what the thoughts are that we have to change. Why do you think that you are having those thoughts? This is a deeper investigation. And why are you feeling that way when this trigger comes into your field of experience? And it does have something to do with all of these various assumptions, expectations that we have. But this is a deeper investigation. What's going on under the surface? Do you think everyone else would have similar thoughts? This is just to give you that context that, again, we're not identical. Not everybody's having the same experience that you're having. You're just one person in this world that's triggered in various ways, that's having particular thoughts. Not everybody thinks that way. Not everybody is triggered in that way. Just give some space around it to recognize that, hey, well, maybe I can learn to be more like that person who isn't triggered when they go to the restaurant and their favorite meal isn't on the menu. Number five, if your thoughts subsequently led to reacting to the situation or object, that is the third arrow, what factors played a role in that reaction? Again, this is where we might get into some of these other things that sometimes do play a role. And I'll just mention them very briefly. Remember that I mentioned how there were 6 factors. These are the 3 main ones: an object, we've got the seed for anger, and then we think inappropriately about that situation or object. There's also the influence of what we call misleading friends. I was talking earlier about how, like, you might get on the phone with somebody and say, you won't believe what this person did to me. And then they start giving you maybe more fuel to say, you really ought to do something to them. You really ought to get back at them. And then suddenly you find you're shooting that third arrow, right? That is really disarming yourself too, may harm the other person. What other factors played a role? Misleading friends play a role to some degree. Also, even other what we might call cultural or social influences can affect us, right? Where, like, we start reading more of these things on the internet that keep feeding our and fueling our anger, and suddenly then we feel more justified in our anger because people shouldn't behave this way, nobody should be this way, and then we feel kind of justified in doing that. Society has a way of justifying a lot of angry responses to things, right? So those are some other factors that do play a role. But that question is to kind of get at, if you did go to the third arrow step, if you did say or do something that was directed at the object that triggered the anger for you, what fed into that? What caused you to get to that level of reaction? Number 6 is kind of opening the door for what we're going to do with the rest of our time. Can you imagine responding more constructively to the situation? Can you even imagine it at that point? I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. Can you imagine that there's a healthier way to work with that situation, with that trigger? What thoughts might support reducing anger and having a more beneficial outcome to the situation? That's again what we're going to be looking at this afternoon and through next Saturday, is like, what are the things that we can actually do at that time that reframe it, that give us thoughts that are more appropriate and appropriate mental attention that is going to be more beneficial, going to help the situation to be resolved more ideally. So that gets us through that. And let me leave this now for practice 2. Any questions on what I talked about so far? Online, anyone? You can put up your little hand icon if you wish under the reactions button on Zoom. Those of you who are in the Gompa, we do have a microphone for on the Gompa if anyone would like to ask a question. Not seeing any. Okay. Again, normally, and I'm talking too much probably, and when we start this afternoon for sure, I want to do at least one little investigation, a meditation. What I'd like to do with the rest of the time we have right now, though, if there are no questions, is go ahead and go through the next topic, which I think is one that we can cover pretty easily, which is the disadvantages, the detrimental effects of anger and the positive effects of being patient, the benefits of that. And why do I throw this out there? This is oftentimes given as like one of the most basic meditations that we can do to help kind of relieve some of our anger. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm skipping over the mindfulness part. Oops, sorry. I was jumping ahead. We do want to talk a little bit about before we get, no, I'm sorry, that's correct. We get to the mindfulness part later. Okay, good. I'm not jumping ahead. Let's talk about this and go through the readings on this, because there's not really, I think, too much. It's that kind of revolutionary or whatever. Did I read her section on this? Maybe I didn't. Maybe I don't need to read everything. Okay. More regarding the arisal of anger. Again, what His Holiness is talking about here is again the building up of hatred and anger and so on that can happen on the basis of our thoughts. This bit from Venerable Children. Oops, you've got some noises going on here in the Gompa. We have, in terms of this passage, let me go ahead and read this. I think it's worthwhile. Anger is inaccurate in its assessment of reality because, by definition, it is based on exaggeration or superimposition of negative qualities. However, when we are angry, we don't feel that we're exaggerating or superimposing anything. We feel that we're right. In fact, the angry mind seems to be very clear. I'm right, you're wrong, you need to change. I like that phrase because, again, this is just pointing at the degree to which, when we are in under the control of that inappropriate mental attention, we are convinced of the truth of our reality, right? Our perception. It's only our perception, only our story. Again, maybe that's just the beginning of this one. We won't go into the example. You can read the example on your own. Under the influence of anger, we select a few negative details and form a limited view that we are reluctant to change. Right? Again, these are things I've kind of touched on already. Holding on to and nurturing a fixed, inaccurate opinion of someone breeds suspicion and continual unhappiness. When we are mad at someone, everything they do appears wrong, and we take even the simplest act as more evidence of that our negative view of them is correct. Okay. This little bit I want to talk about though, because I think this is an important part of it. Psychologists speak of a refractory period that accompanies an emotion. During this time, we are closed to any advice or reasonable interpretation that contradicts our view. We can neither think clearly about a situation nor accept other interpretations of it that well meaning people offer. The refractory period may be short, just a few seconds. In fact, we're going to see a little passage later that speaks to how physiologically it takes about 6 seconds for the initial stimulus to process through in terms of what happens in our body. Or we may actually have refractory periods that last years and even decades. When the emotion subsides and we are able to look at the event more clearly, we readily see, as others do, that anger's interpretation is incorrect. And there are stories that kind of go through the thread of this, but this is an important one. When we recognize that in the heat of the moment, when we are experiencing something, particularly something that's quite challenging, that is registering as a negative experience for us, that's that trigger. When there is a refractory period, where even though something might be required of us during that time, we're often unable to do something different. Now, I'm not saying that that is cast in stone and that we then don't even try to apply different thinking or what have you. I think that all can be changed, but we do have to recognize that as long as we buy into that and start to go down that pathway, it's going to be very hard for the mind to change. That's why it's important to catch things as quickly as possible, but nonetheless, catch them when you can. Like me back driving in San Francisco many years ago, catch it even at the end and go, oh, wow, that's something I want to change. And then maybe you'll catch it closer to uh, the beginning point, and maybe eventually even at the beginning point. This happens over time. But recognize that there is this refractory period, where we're sort of not capable of necessarily doing anything because we've been triggered by something. And we need to be attentive to that, but not do what we try to not feed that, not accentuate that through this inappropriate attention. Maybe a while before we can replace it with more positive thoughts. Sorry, I ended up going back to all of this that was in this beginning part. But again, I think you can read many of these passages yourself and kind of gain some appreciation for what's said there on the basis of what I have talked about. I might mention that this paragraph at the top of the screen there does talk about how everything that we experience that's coming from the mind of anger is through the filter of me, I, my, and mine. This sort of self-centeredness that is driving the whole show according to Buddhism. And we have a tendency to only see things on the basis of how they affect us. And we think that we're correct in that, that our opinion matters, how we are feeling matters. Well, it matters to some degree, but it's not the only thing going on, right? We got many other people that we're interacting with. So again, that ingrained self-centered view that Venerable Chodron's talking about is an important thing to be attentive to. And often, again, we're quite neglecting what's going on around us. And I won't spend the rest of the time going through that entire passage. Let's go on to this next section, because this is really a very powerful way. I often sometimes call this Buddhist advertising, where we kind of have to get what are the advantages of doing A versus the disadvantages of continuing to do B. And again, I think it is important that we actually, gain some appreciation for that. Now, I'm not going to focus as much on the advantages of patience because I think we know and we'll see as we practice the many advantages of eliminating these disadvantages. Let me go through what is said here from Venerable Children first. Anger may give us a tremendous sense of power, but at the same time, it undermines the happiness of ourselves and others. As Genendrup, the first Dalai Lama, said in a prayer, that the female prayer to the female Buddha, Tara, I think is what it should say, driven by the wind of inappropriate attention, amidst a tumult of smoke clouds of misconduct, it has the power to burn down forests of positive potential. The fire of anger, save us from this danger. You see that anger is the most destructive emotion. That's why I always like teaching on overcoming anger, is because I do see that it's the one that often we need the guidance on most, because it can be so destructive. And we often use fire, storm, as the idea of how anger can be very destructive. Venerable Chodron says, is anger beneficial? We generally consider something beneficial if it promotes happiness, but when we ask ourselves, am I happy when I'm angry? The answer is undoubtedly no. We may feel a surge of physical energy due to physiological reasons, but emotionally we feel miserable. Thus, from our own experience, we see that anger does not promote happiness. In addition, we don't communicate well when we're angry. I'm going to skip over what she says there and talk about it a little bit. I mean, think back yourself. And the last time that you were flustered at something that was going on, were you a good communicator at that time? Were you able to actually go, oh, this is exactly what I want to articulate and the way that I want to say it so that it's taken in the right way? Instead, we usually stuff starts coming out of our mouth and it's not so good. It's not a pretty picture. Of course, nowadays that everyone's got their little cameras on their phones and they start filming everyone, behaving in these particular ways, like somebody accosting somebody in the park about their dog or something. Suddenly, you get to see what you're like when you get angry or upset, because everyone's, broadcasting it to the world. It's not a pretty picture, right? We don't communicate well. We don't have the ability to have some composure and a real groundedness in terms of what we want to communicate. Mhm. And these are things that if we just even had that, if somebody was like filming you at the moment, showed it to you in the very next moment, you'd be like, I don't ever want to act that way again, right? Under the influence of anger, we also say and do things that we later regret. And I don't think we need to go into that in a lot of detail. We've all done things that we regret on the basis of our anger arising. Next paragraph. Further, anger can result in people shunning us. Why is nobody wanting to hang around with me? Well, you're always angry all the time. Again, I just used angry to refer to the person. You always have anger all the time. So again, we have to see what happens. Do people want to be around us when we're having a mind of anger, right? Probably not. We don't even like to be around other people who have angry thoughts and what have you. In addition, maintaining anger over a long time fosters resentment and bitterness within us. Sometimes we meet old people, I think even young people, who've stockpiled their grudges over many years, carrying hatred and disappointment with them wherever they go. None of us wants to grow old like that. But by not counteracting our anger, we allow this to happen. I'm going to leave it at, this is the only other place I think where I quote from Geshe Thupten Loden in terms of a more traditional approach to this. But he's pointing out very contemporary things that happen here, right? That we can see racial tensions, we can see tensions between nations, we can see so much of it coming out of anger. Isolation and loneliness, that's again maybe a byproduct of being shunned, that we might find that we have no one around us because we're having that state of mind that is not easy to be around. The delusion of anger also takes your mind completely out of control and forces you to manufacture your own future suffering. When your anger subsides, it is replaced by embarrassment, guilt, and regret. And sometimes people get so angry that they destroy their wealth and possessions. They throw a brick through the television, blah, 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 blah. Another fault of anger at the bottom there is that it distorts your appearance, making you ugly, repulsive, and unattractive. I mean, if you do have that unfortunate situation of someone uh, putting you on video while you're angry, well, what do you look like? The people who are angry are not very attractive. Even an otherwise beautiful looking person will totally change in appearance when under the influence of anger. Their face, speech, actions become like that of another person. Again, so these are kind of pointing to all of this. I don't need to go word by word through all of these various passages. They're there for you to read outside of the class and kind of meditate on, reflect on. But we see that there are maybe kind of two main categories of what we talk about in terms of the disadvantages of anger. First one is for yourself. And without a doubt, many of the things I pointed out have a detrimental impact on ourselves. It's not a happy place to be. Of course, they even say that anger physiologically can cause heart problems and all kinds of other things with our bodies because of that rise in our blood pressure and everything that comes along with that emotion. What's interesting about anger, probably more so than many of the other afflictions, is that it manifests quite quickly in terms of physiology. So there's detrimental impacts to us physically, mentally, and of course spiritually in terms of you know, only making ourselves more ingrained to have that responsive or reaction of anger in regard to what's going on that is unfavorable, unpleasant for us. There's also detrimental impacts to others. And certainly we see in our world how anger can go all the way to the place of killing someone out of anger, right? This happens in our society way too frequently. And there was just that situation that was so horrific to even read about. I'm sorry if I'm going to upset anyone's mind by talking about it, but there was a man in Pennsylvania who killed his father who worked for the Biden administration because of various thoughts he got and inappropriate mental attention that took root in him shooting his father. And horrible things after that, well, I won't go into. But you can kill your own dear loved one out of anger. One person who has taken care of you, who you love and have taken care of as well, you can take their life through anger. And again, we don't have to go that far to see it, but we have to be cognizant of the detrimental impact. So what I've done in terms of the meditation, and we'll start with this when we resume in the afternoon, just doing a short reflection. Let me pull that up on the screen. A little practice of recollecting the detrimental effects of anger. Let me pull this down. Every time I go down there, another little thing comes up on my screen that makes it hard for me to pull it up. The exercise is essentially to reflect upon your own experiences with anger and then go through these questions in a similar way to the arrows that we just went through and examine kind of it from the point of view of wanting to have the opposite effect, wanting to practice patience because we see that with the mind of patience, these detrimental impacts, these disadvantages will go away. And then again, examine, it says, or whether you are able to bring these faults to mind as a deterrent to current situations in which you might generate anger. And the degree to which you have some familiarity with these will be the degree to which you can bring them to mind. That when somebody says something, you'll go, oh, I don't really want to go down that pathway. I've been here before. I've done this way too many times. So number one, when you have anger in your mind, does it make you feel happy or miserable? Which one is it? Get clear about this is not a great experience. When you have anger, does your mind feel at peace and in control or disturbed and running wild? How does having anger make you feel physically? What effects does it have on your health? And how many nights have we lost sleep because we've been ruminating over something somebody did to us and just continuing to perpetuate those thoughts of anger? Have thoughts of anger ever kept you from sleep, ruined your appetite, or adversely impacted some other aspect of your life? Well, then you get more evidence about why anger is not such a great thing to follow. When anger is in your mind, are you able to communicate your thoughts calmly, clearly, effectively? When you speak or act from your anger, do you later feel embarrassed, have regret for what you did, feel guilty about your actions, or have self hatred even? We beat ourselves up too easily in this culture. Does your anger ever result in you being shunned by others or experiencing more loneliness in your life? Again, all of these things might be more evidence of how we can begin to see anger as undesirable, not something we want to go down that pathway at all. Number 8, has prolonged anger ever made you bitter or resentful towards others? And maybe some of you are still carrying some anger towards others. We often use the analogy that kind of having that resentment is like walking around with a hot coal waiting to throw it at the person who offended you. But you're getting burned by carrying that hot coal, right? Number 9, thinking about how others appear to you when they are expressing their anger. How do you think you appear at similar times? Maybe we don't see ourselves in that angry state. Nobody's filming us. but we're seeing others when they're angry. Our faces must look similarly disturbed. In general, does anger resolve the problem or situation that provoked it, or does it complicate and compound the suffering you were trying to avoid? This is the big one, is like, it's useless. Does anger ever really get things done? Now, again, we're talking about the delusion of anger, where there is a hateful, spiteful kind of attitude towards it. We're not talking about kind of having a sort of stance that we're making in the world around social injustice and making some progress and moving things into a better domain. We're talking about most of our daily situations that we encounter. The anger doesn't really help. There's detrimental effects for others, though. When you have anger in your mind, how does it make others around you feel? When you express yourself verbally or physically with anger, what effect does that have on others who witness it? And a few more. Do others who are the object of your anger tend to be responsive and agreeable? Or do they get hurt by what you did, become inflamed with anger themselves, and possibly even retaliate? And the evidence is there for us to simply see in our own lives, our own experience. Has your expressing anger ever resulted in having ongoing conflict with others, creating damage to a relationship, or even terminating a friendship? Again, honesty. I talked about that at the beginning of today. Be honest with yourself as you do these sorts of reflections. Again, we're going to do this when we come back at 1:30. Um, we have to be clear that our own state of anger has probably resulted in a lot of suffering and conflict with others. Number 5, has anger become a habitual pattern in a close relationship you have with another, to the point where it becomes commonplace or routine and is simply accepted as part of that relationship? I put this in here. It's not something that there's a reading for, but I do think that that sometimes happens. You get kind of like, we have this stereotype of like the bickering couple, right? Where people are just constantly in that state of like one-upping each other on negative statements that they say to each other, that it's kind of furthering the anger, the resentment. And yet it's a couple, yet it's two people who stay together. But is it a healthy relationship to kind of be in that place of just continually trying to get the other person's goat or something? I don't know, I use that phrase a lot. Maybe it's my Wisconsin upbringing. uh, okay, so don't get into, I mean, I'm not saying you absolutely should get out of a relationship like that, but begin to examine it and question it. Is this really a healthy pattern? To be getting each other's goat continually. Number 6, have you ever physically harmed others or damaged their possessions due to anger? And these are just gauging to what degree do you have a problem with anger that perhaps you should be more cognizant of, because the disadvantages are incredible. Some people, again, don't even see these disadvantages. They just continue to act in these ways. Number 7, can you find any real benefits for others from your mind of anger? Probably doesn't benefit ourselves, obviously, but it moreover doesn't benefit others either. All right. Again, this whole investigation of like, especially seeing these disadvantages is, as I said, sort of Buddhist advertising. It's to get us in the ballpark of saying, I need to do something about this. Nonetheless, even reflecting on the disadvantages can be a means of stopping anger from arising in certain situations. I'm not going to say it's across the board, because sometimes we need stronger tools. That's what we're going to be looking at throughout the remainder of this. But this is one that kind of gets us really motivated to do something about anger. Any questions or comments before we take our lunch break or dinner break, wherever you are? I know there are people from other parts of the world who are there with us. Or breakfast break. I don't know if it's a breakfast break for anybody, perhaps, but all right. So let's just have a few moments of dedication. We won't do the dedication prayers. Let's think really strongly about whatever thoughts that we've had. Again, hopefully they've been appropriate thoughts, not things that are generating distortions in our minds. We've had these that we've cultivated through listening to these teachings, reflecting on them, thinking about them. The time we've already spent together today, these 2 hours, we've planted a lot of seeds. We're going to continue to nurture and grow throughout this weekend, these 2 Saturdays. But just make sure that you have this thought of, may whatever has occurred, whatever I have done, may it become the cause, not just for my own welfare, my own well-being, but for the welfare of all sentient beings. All right. So again, during the break, if you can, if you do have the readings, it might be good to read over the ones that I kind of skirted over. Because again, I just don't feel like I want to go through every word, or otherwise it becomes a little laborious. And you all have those to read. They're there, accessible for you. Or if you're out to lunch with somebody or at a meal with somebody who you want to talk with about this, that's good to have some conversation about it. When we return, we'll do a short reflection on the disadvantages of anger, just to kind of taste that and see if we can see that for ourselves. And then we'll resume, continue, carry on. All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Be well.